Hey everybody, welcome to the very first episode of Fulfilled. I'm your host, Rebecca Sheehan. I cannot believe I'm sitting here right now starting this podcast. First of all, it seems like there have been so many random little things trying to derail this. Last night I was getting ready to finish typing out this episode, everything I wanted to say, and I burned my hand really badly on a pan. And thankfully it's not that bad. If you're watching this, you can see it's just a little bit red. But it's funny, I did resolve with this new podcast to be a bit less scripted and more off the cuff, so maybe that burn situation was all divine providence. Anyway, in this first episode, even though it's not easy for me, I'm going to share my story so you can get to know me a little better and why I'm doing this. But we'll start with the show's name and what you can expect from this podcast. So, fulfilled. In Christianity, we hear this word quite a bit. It basically refers to the aspects of Jesus' life that relate to specific predictions or symbols from the Old Testament. For example, that he was born in Bethlehem, that his lineage is that of King David's, that he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, and of course, his death and resurrection. There's also an overarching big picture meaning of fulfilled, that God's plan all along to restore our broken relationship with him was fulfilled in Jesus. I just love that so much. Secondly, my goal with this podcast is to inspire and equip you, whether you're a total skeptic or have been going to church your whole entire life or somewhere in between, to grow closer to your faith. I love C.S. Lewis, so I'm probably going to be quoting him quite a bit throughout this podcast, but listen to this quote. "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." So in each episode, I'm going to aim to show you how Christianity not only illuminates what can be a dark and gloomy world, but how it shines a light on who we are, where we are, and the path that each of us is meant to follow. In terms of what you can expect each episode to look like, my background is in TV journalism. I used to be a local reporter and anchor for Fox, ABC, and NBC stations. So the podcast format is going to be what I do best and love most, interviewing interesting and inspiring people who can teach us a thing or two. And of course, we'll have some fun along the way. But as I mentioned in the beginning, for this first episode, I'm going to do something that a lot of journalists, including myself, aren't too comfortable with, which is telling my own story. And my story begins with the final reason this podcast is called Fulfilled. It's because I grew up Jewish and have a totally different perspective on it now. So of course, many of the early Christians were Jews, but of all the Jews on earth today, our ancestors were the ones who were not. Here's a little excerpt I gave at our family's baptism a few months ago, which I think describes it best. I said, "It's funny to think about Jesus' family tree. It's got all these fruit-bearing branches grafted onto the tree." If you're not familiar, grafted is Christian speak for becoming an adopted child of God. But what about the branches originally there? It's nothing less than evidence of God's goodness, power, and will that this branch, brittle for thousands of years, is finally starting to flower. It might have looked barren, but God didn't prune it. He breathed life into it instead. Some might call my Christian faith crazy. Others, I know, find it completely offensive. But I believe the technical name for it is fulfilled. So how on earth did I get here, launching a Christian podcast? Both my parents are Jewish, and they did their due diligence raising me with all the customs and traditions of being Jewish. Somehow, despite all this, I had it in my heart that someday I would find Christ, even though I had no idea when or where this would happen. Now, you could just say that this was me as a kid trying to fit in, maybe even jealous that I didn't have all of the chocolate Easter eggs or the Christmas presents, but that wasn't it. It's interesting, when I look back and try to think of certain formative experiences that led me to where I am today, two of them actually took place in different countries, and I was trying to think of why. And I think it's maybe because I felt far enough away from my normal life that I was maybe more open or less afraid of upsetting anyone by feeling a certain way. So the first one was when I was lucky enough to take a trip with my high school history class to Italy. We visited the city of Assisi, which is home to St. Francis of Assisi, who started the Franciscan order of monks in the 13th century. Anyway, we walked into this large church there, and inside was this tiny little medieval building. It almost looked like a hut. And I learned that this was the original structure that dated back to the 9th century, this little chapel. And I went in there and I just felt bathed in holiness. I couldn't even describe it. And later, when I researched it, I found out that that is where St. Francis of Assisi was praying when he saw Jesus, and that is where he decided to dedicate his life to Christ and helping others. Right there. And I didn't even know it. So there was that. And then a somewhat opposite experience happened to me when I was studying abroad in Paris during college. You know, when you're 20, you're trying to find yourself, figure out who you are, and I wanted to try to get closer to my Jewish heritage because I really wanted God to be part of my life. And the high holidays were coming up, the Jewish New Year. And I asked a friend if he wanted to come with me to try to go to a synagogue or temple. So we found one online, and when we went there the next day, we couldn't find it anywhere. There were no signs. We were lost, literally, and later I found out figuratively as well. So we finally found it and walked in, and there was just all of this sort of chaotic sounding shouting. I realized then that this was an Orthodox synagogue, which doesn't have musical instruments or praying in unison, but it's basically the men chanting prayers on their own. Another thing about Orthodox synagogues, or at least this one, was that the genders were segregated. So I went to go sit with the women, which was behind this wooden barrier. There were just a few holes in this wooden barrier so that you could see through to the men chanting, and then in front of them to where the Torahs were kept, the Holy Scrolls. So basically, I couldn't see or understand anything that was going on in this service. I could read some Hebrew, but I definitely didn't know what any of it meant. And it was just a very troubling experience. And remember that barrier, because I will come back to that later. So after that, and throughout my young adulthood, I sort of let religion take a back seat. And I thought, well, maybe, if the man I marry is Christian, maybe his family will be a big Christian family. So I can just sort of slip right in, no questions asked. Because in Judaism, the family's religion is a lot of it. I thought it would be easy. But guess what? I met John, my now husband. Yes, he was raised Christian, but didn't have deep, profound ties to it. And he actually saw the beauty in Judaism, and he told me he was a free agent when it came to religion. And I was thinking to myself, no, you are not supposed to say that. Fast forward a few years, we are happily married and busy with 3 preschool-aged kids who are just starting to talk and ask about God and where people go when they die, as young kids tend to do. It was then that we knew it was time to kick our faith journey up a notch and stop coasting along, celebrating both Jewish and Christian holidays. We honored the traditions, but sort of missed the forest for the trees. Anyway, there's a wonderful couple that John and I are friends with who are devout Catholics, and the wife's grandmother was Jewish, and she feels very connected to her Jewish roots. So naturally, she and I would talk quite a bit about faith. And I think it was at a Cardinals game. I know I'm not doing the female gender any favors when I say that she and I were not paying attention to the game. She mentioned a Bible in a Year podcast she had listened to. It piqued my interest, and I gave the first few episodes a try. When I got to Genesis 25, the story of Isaac, Abraham's son, and Isaac's wife, Rebecca, I was like, wait a second, she's the mother of twin boys like I am? And even more uncanny was that, like Esau, the older twin, our older twin was sort of hairy too. The younger twin, kind of like Jacob, also had a sly streak, a little twinkle in his eye. So I couldn't help comparing the sets of twins. Of course, that didn't last long, as that story got pretty dysfunctional pretty quickly. Anyway, a month or 2 later, we found ourselves home on Christmas Eve. It was an unseasonably warm night for December 24th in St. Louis, and I had remembered seeing signs at the church down the street for a Christmas Eve candlelight service. My husband and I both had a similar urge to go, so we walked over to check it out. It's hard to describe the feeling that both of us had during that service. For me, singing all those classic Christmas songs I had loved for years, with a meaningful sermon, and of course, that powerful candlelit singing of Silent Night. Something had just changed in us, and John and I knew that we were on the precipice of something great and entirely new for us. So the next Sunday, we decided to go back with our kids, and then the next Sunday after that, and so on. We actually ended up moving just 6 months later, but our new house was only 5 minutes away from a church that this church we had been going to had planted, And that new church also ended up being our kids' school, so it was a pretty perfect scenario. From there, our family's walk in faith only grew. I've got to give a shout out to my Bible study ladies because I'd never experienced such a close intergenerational bond with a group of women like that before. Through deep intellectual discourse over Bible passages, to prayers, laughter, and tears. It sounds so cheesy, but that's actually what we did. Those Tuesday mornings were honestly the highlight of every week for me. And I don't exactly remember when or how my faith background came up in that group, but I was definitely shy about the fact that I grew up Jewish. Deep down, humans are social creatures. I think we all have that intrinsic desire to not be the odd one out. So what I didn't expect was the outpouring of love, support, and gratitude for sharing my story. See, I was thinking the best case scenario that they would still like me despite my Jewish background, but I was not expecting that my story would inspire them in any way. Me inspire these amazing, perfect-seeming church-going Presbyterian moms and grandmas who, in my mind, never ever sinned. Of course, as I grew in my knowledge of Christianity, both on the pages of the Bible and in my life, I realized that a lot of these women I thought were perfect were actually struggling with some pretty tough things. None of us is perfect, except for Jesus, and that is why we all need him, because we definitely can't do it alone. Our family was baptized at our church this past spring. Knowing about my unconventional path to Christ, our pastor had asked me to share my faith testimony. To be honest, I really didn't want to. It wasn't the public speaking aspect of it, it was the vulnerability of it. But since I witnessed how it inspired my Bible study friends, I agreed to do it and spoke at our baptism in front of the whole congregation. It's on video somewhere, but I never shared that speech beyond those church walls, which I know sort of misses the whole point of the Great Commission in Matthew. And the word gospel literally means good news that ought to unabashedly be shared. I remember after our baptism asking my husband and some friends how they thought I should go about sharing more of my baptism testimony beyond our church family. And they all said the same thing: you'll know when the time is right. And I just love that so much because clearly this is now that season in my life. And I will let you guys know when I post a link to that video because I would love for you to see it. In my speech, I talked about how I journeyed through the Bible in a year through that podcast I mentioned. I appreciated it in such a deep, profound way because to me, reading the Old Testament was like one long family history lesson. The story of Jacob's son, Joseph, being sold into slavery in Egypt and then rising up and his brothers bowing down to him at the end. Sorry for the spoiler. Was like a riveting page turner and I couldn't wait to see what happened next. Or the heartbreak of King David's lazy lust for Bathsheba that he so passionately repented to God for in Psalm 51. The tears came, though, when I started reading John's Gospel. The gist of it was, where has this been all my life? Part of me was so sad that I had never, ever read this before, but the other part of me was so grateful that in my early 30s, I finally had. This might have been one of the craziest parts, though. Remember the story I told about feeling stuck behind that barrier in that Orthodox synagogue in Paris? Well, when I learned about the construction of the tabernacle in Exodus 25 through 40, I read about the Holy of Holies. So the Holy of Holies is, just like it sounds, holiest area in the place of worship, which housed the Ark of the Covenant and the Ten Commandments. And it was separated with a barrier from the rest of the people and the rest of the temple. And only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, nobody else, to give sacrifices to God for our sins. So this was a literal barrier between God and his people. And the whole Old Testament, if you think about it, is about this barrier, this separation between God and us, because we're sinful and we cannot be reconciled to him until Jesus. You might know where I'm going with this, but since I had never read the New Testament, imagine my surprise when I get to the part where Jesus is on the cross and suddenly his temple garment, his veil, is torn from top to bottom. Now, if a person had torn it, it would have been torn from the bottom up, but this was not that. This was to symbolize the tearing down of that barrier between God and humanity. That barrier that I felt so strongly in that synagogue in Paris was now completely torn away with Jesus and with my accepting him as my Savior. whoa. And just putting that whole story together, it makes me practically tear up just thinking about it again. Now, the Bible is filled with so many rich lessons, symbols, hidden connections, and most of all, reading the whole thing just deepens our relationship with God in such a profound way. So after reading it once, a few months later, I decided to do it again. You might already know that since January 1st, I started this not so minor project of recording a little video or posting some sort of insight after every single episode. Now that has been the gift that keeps on giving, both through the awesome conversations and debates that it's led to, but taking everything external out of it, it's been the biggest blessing to delve deeper into each of these chapters and understand each one enough to contextualize it, both in terms of relating it to other Bible passages, but of course to our daily life. If you want to follow along with me on that journey, my handle is Rebecca Sheehan on both Instagram and TikTok. One of my constant prayers to God is for him to use me in any way that he can to honor him and to bring others closer to him. So once I got comfortable with the idea of maybe starting a Christian podcast, I just felt flooded with this sense of excitement, but also content, happiness, just that I was doing the right thing. You know how they say that you can tell a real smile from a phony one because in a real smile, your eyes tend to smile too and get all crinkly at the edges. So I swear to you, whenever I feel the Holy Spirit working through me, I have this feeling that I'm doing what I'm meant to be doing. I just feel the biggest smile spreading across my face. It feels like I'm literally just smiling with my eyes, not even my mouth. So if I continue on this path, I hope to report back in 10 years that I have terrible crow's feet. And I pray that at least some of these episodes will inspire, ignite, awaken that sort of smile within you too. So if you get those smiling eyes, crow's feet, sorry, not sorry. At the end of every episode, which we are getting to right now, I am going to leave you guys with a meaningful Bible verse, either one that's on theme with the topic of the episode or just a favorite Bible verse of whoever I'm interviewing. So today I will leave you with this one, which has truly helped me get through some of the toughest times throughout my unconventional faith journey. Because now I know that being a Christian certainly wasn't easy for the early Christians who were persecuted, and it's not easy today. Our beliefs and values are increasingly at odds with the world we live in. So here it is, John 16:33. I've said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for listening to this first episode of Fulfilled, and I can't wait to see you next time.